Welcome to the MOGL podcast. I'm Tim Bryson, Director of Athlete Education and Compliance, and I'm the host of our show. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you're a returning community member, welcome back. As y'all know, the MOGL podcast is dedicated to educating all NIL athletes and brands on how to ensure compliance, how to maximize NIL activity, and how to make a difference in the ever-evolving NIL landscape. This podcast episode, no longer in person, right? You've seen the last few episodes over the last several weeks. We've been in person visiting different university partners that are tied with MOGL. But this conversation happened in a very NIL-centric way as I stumbled upon this individual and their content on the greatest platform ever, Twitter, which is undefeated. Please never charge for it, Elon. But nevertheless, I reached out and I said, yo, we'd love to have a conversation with you on the MOGL podcast, just given what you were talking about on the tweet. And I'll make sure that we prioritize that as part of our conversation today. Without further ado, y'all help me welcome Maddie Walsh to the MOGL podcast. What's up, Maddie?
Hey, happy to be here.
I'm happy to be here too. And I'm not gonna lie to you, Maddie. I normally am very deliberate on like what shirt I decide to wear, of course, recording on Zoom. And I thought about a soccer jersey, and I was like, no. I thought about another jersey, I was like, no. I said, I gotta bring back the ACC rivalry, yo.
Yeah, you gotta rep Maryland. Well, I'm wearing my Cav Futures merch right now, but I should have worn UVA. You should have warned me.
Oh, it's like, I mean, I'm gonna need that. Is that crew neck? I'm gonna need that crew neck or something at some point. But definitely excited.
The fansmeetsidols.com/Cav Futures. This little side plug. You can get your Cav Futures merch.
Oh, y'all said that too?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, we have our own line and everything.
Oh, let me find out. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna check that out, yo. Well, like I said, I'm excited to talk with you definitely about NIL education, as this podcast is definitely centered and focused on. But first things first, right? We start every podcast episode with storytelling. And so for those that know you and for those that may not know you, Maddie, what's your story?
Yeah, well, I ended up in NIL in kind of a real roundabout way. So I started working in sports back as a junior at University of Southern California. Fight on to all the Trojans out there. And I was just a volunteer recruiting intern, but that's kind of how I fell in love with college sports. And I grew up watching college football, so already loved it, but didn't see it as a career field until I was working at USC. And then I graduated into the pandemic. So wanted to keep working in college sports, but it wasn't really an option at the time. So I kind of took a step back, but wanted to just keep my foot in the door. And so I was doing recruiting consulting and basically going around talking to high school teams, high school athletes, and telling them how they could use like social media and personal branding as a way around the lack of, new tape or no elite camp over the summer, whatever it was. So that was interesting and just kind of a side hustle. But then as it evolved, I kept doing research like, okay, what's next in recruiting? What's happening? And this NIL thing came up. And at the time, like nobody was really talking about it. So did some research and I ended up like locking myself in my room and writing this 6-page paper, basically detailing, okay, what is the industry? Who are the major players? Like who is Open Doors and who is Influencer and who are these different companies popping up? And they got noticed. So I just put it out on LinkedIn and the blog that I'd been running for my recruiting side hustle. And it got a lot of attention. Because, like I said, at the time, no one was really talking about it, even though it was December 2020. So it was almost time, it was about to change. So that started a lot of conversations. And I ended up working with some other like third-party companies, which was great. But I missed college football. So I spent about 6 months kind of doing something similar to what you're doing education and creating those materials. But UVA was actually the first football team to start hiring out of the pandemic. And so I was like, okay, I'm in Seattle at the time and I love what I'm doing. I love this NIL stuff, but I want to work for a team. So they stole me away from the West Coast and brought me all the way out here. And it was awesome. I mean, I was in operations and having a lot of fun, but I then found myself missing NIL, and UVA was actually pretty behind at the time. Maybe I shouldn't say behind. They were being cautious, a lot more cautious than some of the other schools, or even in the ACC. So I was kind of looking at all of this potential that, the student athletes had and their interest in NIL just based on my side conversations. And then the Cav Futures popped up. So they decided to create a collective. It was started by a couple of former football players. And they wanted to have this, we call it a collective, but now we're kind of moving more towards entities. So I'll say an NIL entity that was dedicated to all student athletes, not just football, not just basketball. And that really spoke to me because, you know, as you guys at MOGL know, like this is for everybody, especially want to keep those like female student athletes involved. And so I reached out to the executive director at the time, and he had just been hired like 2 weeks before I sent this email. And I was like, hey, I know the athletes, I know NIL, I know UVA pretty well, like, let's talk. And he heard me out. So like we met up and we went to breakfast, and I literally showed up at the diner with like a printed out PowerPoint presentation on why he should hire me and like why athlete engagement was important. And it worked. Yeah, I guess that was like my first sales pitch. And he hired me as director of marketing and athlete engagement.
This is a great start to our conversation, and congratulations on you creating your own opportunity. I think that's a reflection of what NIL can be in many ways with current athletes, which I know again we'll unwrap a little bit later. But don't want us to skip over a couple of things that you kind of mentioned, but not really. The first of which you mentioned before, you're from Seattle, right?
Yeah.
So let's just talk briefly about Seattle. You left what, Washington State country to go to I call it the other USC, because shout out to my Gamecocks, but to the other USC, like.
Yeah, I had never been to Charlottesville before I accepted the job. So I was really taking a leap of faith, but I have loved living here, and my parents were not super thrilled about me moving across the country, but there was no hesitation. Like they said, you got to go. This sounds like a really fun job. Go do what you got to do, and then like we'll come visit. So shout out to mom and dad for sure.
No, it's definitely, but I'm even saying, I mean, that's a whole other journey within itself. But I'm saying, how did you get from Seattle to SoCal?
Okay, so SoCal was I went to USC was able to get an academic scholarship there, which was awesome. And then, like I said, fell in with the football team. And then when I was back home in the pandemic looking for jobs and like literally scouring job markets every day for football, there was a position that I wasn't sure I was qualified for with UVA. It was actually a position above me. And I applied it anyways because I was like, whatever, worst they can say is no. But I DM'd some of the people who worked there, including the director of football operations. And I was like, hey, I applied for this job, just wanted to, you know, flag my profile and would love to hear more about the team culture. And they responded and said, actually, we probably won't hire you for that job that you just applied to, but there's this other job that's not posted publicly. You should apply to this one. And it worked out. So I'm really glad I shot my shot and, you know, slid into his DMs, because otherwise I never would have gotten that job.
So where does that come from though, right? Because I think for some people, especially stereotypically, but also statistically speaking and socially, like men are the ones that apply to jobs they don't feel they're qualified for, right? But where does this intuition, this proactivity, right, like this urge, if you would, to just go get it, like where does that come from?
Yeah, I think part of it comes honestly from being around athletes. And, you know, I started working in that USC football internship for fun, but basically I'll make an analogy. Like if you're a football player and you're just showing up to practice, you're not doing enough, right? Like you have to be lifting, you have to be training in the off season, you have to be eating right. And I saw like how hard those guys were working for what they wanted to do. And it just made me want to chase what I was doing that much more and kind of question like, well, what am I not doing? And, you know, through that experience, I just came to the realization that like, I love working in sports. I think I'm good at this operations, marketing, you know, athlete engagement side of things. And not that many people can say I'm good at my job and I like it. So I just want to chase that. Really wanted to just do fun stuff and never settle. So I think that is kind of what my mentality is. But I also, you know, it comes with the flexibility of having parents who are like, yeah, go do it, you know, go do what you got to do. We'll support you no matter what. And being young and right out of college, I'm like, I really have nothing to lose by doing cool stuff, moving where I gotta go, and like, just taking fun opportunities.
I love that, yo. I love that. And a follow-up to that is that one thing that you also mentioned, right, is that you continue to take these different opportunities, especially taking a risk in many ways.
Mhm.
What has kept you grounded, right? Like, how are you taking care of yourself, but also what has kept you grounded through the last now, 3 years, some change, graduating into the pandemic, but also moving across the United States to, pursue your dream, if you will, at UVA?
That's a good question. I mean, I've mentioned family a few times. I think that is the pillar of everything. That's my foundation for sure. So even if I am questioning what I'm doing, I can always call back home and kind of get that reassurance. But on the day to day, I'm really big on big picture perspective and kind of that long term thinking, and knowing that, like, even if today's hard, it's going to get better, or it's for a bigger purpose, or, it's not the end of the world if this one tiny thing doesn't work out. And even if it's a big thing, it feels big now, but every big thing in the past has been resolved eventually, or you just learn to adjust or grow with it. So honestly, I think that big picture really helps, and just knowing that it's never that deep as long as you stick to your values and like what is right, and you can say that you did your best. That's what matters.
This is good, Maddie. Segment 2. I love when podcasts write themselves, right? Again, I don't work
Mhm.
off a script. I mean, I sent you a little outline prior to this, but you just said, and I wrote it down on my phone, every big thing has always been resolved eventually, or you just learn how to adjust and write and work with it.
Yep.
NIL has been this big thing. I put this in quotes, big
Yep.
thing. This big thing that I think, to your point, some people took the wait and see approach. Some people jumped right
Mhm.
in. Some people did both in some way, shape, or form. But at UVA, in this Cav Futures position that I really want you to describe for our listeners today, is
Mhm.
very unique. And then again, I don't know all the numbers or details. You definitely probably more research in this area, just given your role in regards to how Cav Futures operates alongside the institution. So can you just talk
Yeah.
to us more about what is Cav Futures? Like, what is your role, as well as its relationship with the University of Virginia?
Yeah. So, like any NIL collective, we're completely separate from the university, but we work very closely with individuals in the department, just to make sure that they are aware of what we're doing. So we keep them kind of up to date, and then also that we're in compliance. So they've been great about answering questions. Can we do this? Can we not do that? And our relationship with them has really grown over the last year. So what started as kind of like an arm's length distance just to be safe and compliant is getting closer and closer now that the NCAA has said, collectives are okay. You can refer donors, you can be in communication with them. So they've been supportive the whole time, but we're moving towards a lot more public support and kind of a public relationship, which is such a relief. And that didn't come without hard work. I think every school has its own community of NIL orgs or different operations, and we worked really hard to kind of establish credibility. And I will take a little bit of credit for that from the marketing side of things. So in that pitch that I brought to breakfast with me at the local diner, I told the director, you handle the higher ups, like we're going to have donors, we're going to have administrators, we're going to have CEOs who are going to be working with us. I will handle the athletes and then kind of the public facing side. So the social media, the PR, all of that. And that can be really hard when you're in that early business development stage, because it feels like an afterthought. But for us, it's been huge. So, just getting our name out there through social media, finding the right Twitter influencers to write about us, and, getting coverage in the media has helped us get a lot of credibility, and it's how the athletes find us. So I guess to speak to my role, that's kind of the big half of it, is like, how do I tell people about what we're doing? And then the other half is, how do I make sure that stuff gets done? So when we do have a business that's interested, or a sponsor who comes in and they say they want to do like a social media campaign, I will help establish the relationship with the athlete. I'll walk the athlete through the contract and the opportunity. I'll help them make content if they need it. I'll go with them to the event if it's an event, and just really be kind of like I have their back through the whole opportunity.
And how many athletes are at UVA right now, currently? Roughly?
UVA is,
Roughly.
oh boy, we're like the 12th largest athletic department in the country. And I think we have about 750 athletes.
Hmm.
So we have done paid partnerships with about 65, which has been awesome. And that's spread out across like 15 sports. So it's not, again, we're not just like basketball, football, but we've been growing and growing. And outside of those paid partnerships, I think I've had conversations about branding and NIL and financial literacy, taxes, whatever it may be, with athletes from at least every single team. And we have 27 teams.
So let me ask you this thing, right? Because I think one of the things that is I've been interested in, it's been very curious, given I've been at MOGL now 8 months, is that people ask like, right, what is your role? How do you help athletes, whatever. Being at a school or being with a collective that's very closely tied to a school, and shout out to you on a marketing standpoint, because you cannot tell by your website that y'all are an entity, an NIL entity. That's very, very well done. Kudos to you, seriously. But you working with UVA, right? It's UVA. And my role is like D1, D2, D3, NCAA, NAIA, and some high school athletes. I mean, it's very broad in regards to how to evaluate both preparedness and readiness level to address different educational needs or desires with athletes who want to get involved in NIL. Like, what has been, because you've been in that role about almost a year, approaching a year at least. Like, how have you seen and really observed, right? And we'll get to your tweet in just a second, but just the conversation around NIL, keeping this broad on purpose, the climate of NIL, the culture of NIL, both at UVA, but then also given that it's different regionally within the DMV-ish community, I'll throw y'all in there, but also within the ACC as well. And that's a big question, but I want to make sure that I can capture some of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that, UVA has taken a unique approach because they were cautious and wanted to be intentional about how they built a program for NIL. And so as a result, the student athletes have been also a little bit slower to take up on opportunities or an interest. And it's kind of this distant thing like, well, I have school, I have weightlifting, I have tutoring, I have practice. I don't need one more thing. And that's changed for sure in the last few years, especially the last few months, I would say, because we went from, okay, Cav Futures is a thing and they're here, to how do I get involved and how do I get started? And like, what can I do with Cav Futures? So really moving from that awareness to actually having more relationships with athletes, which has been so cool to see and to build. And I guess that as far as the regional environment, I can't speak for Tech and some of those other schools, but I think that the local partnerships are just so important because, not every athlete is going to get that big corporate deal, but like we have a partnership with our local McDonald's franchises, and we have a couple of local nonprofit partnerships. And so the USCs, the real USCs of the world, might get that, Nike, Adidas, whatever, but we are really leaning into those meaningful, prolonged, like 3 or 4 year relationships with the nonprofits, local restaurants, local alumni, like whoever we can tie in to kind of have that sustainable relationship.
Has there been conversation? Again, I've been out of at least campus life for almost a year now, but has there been conversation across the ACC with different, whether it be entities across different institutions or just people, gathering informally or formally about conversation about NIL as well?
Yeah, we do a lot of communication behind the scenes. So we will talk to Country Roads Trust up at West Virginia. They're another great NIL collective. Like they're doing really cool things. And so it goes up and down. Like we will talk to collectives who are bigger than us and doing more than us and kind of say, okay, how did you get there? And then we are constantly being contacted by schools and usually people starting their own collectives who say, okay, how did you get to where you're at? And I love those conversations because there was no blueprint at the beginning of this. There was no plan really, but we're getting closer to that. And we're getting closer to like, how do you start a collective and kind of what are the best practices? And I think that it's not competitive because yes, like a lot of us are kind of in that same recruiting world, but it all benefits student athletes when this stuff is done well.
Crunchyroll Trust. Maddie's going to connect us so we can get you on the podcast next. I definitely want to learn more about what y'all are doing up in Morgantown. But you just mentioned it, right? If NIL, right, is supposed to be this, athlete-centered, athlete priority thing, there's too much competition right now. We need more collaboration. And I'm glad that y'all are at least having those conversations. But Maddie, I think one of the things that I said before, right, that got us even to this point was the tweet that you sent out on, what is this, February 21st at 10:30 a.m. I remember being in the parking lot about to walk in my local Starbucks, if you were to get my afternoon red eye. But the tweet said, right, as a thread, 3 things that surprised me, you, Maddie, about working with student athletes on their hashtag NIL. So it's your tweet, so I'm gonna let you explain more about the tweet, but also some other observations that you've seen over the last year. I would talk to us about one, again, 10:30 a.m. on the 21st of February, pretty random date and time, unless you have a meeting or something scheduled to go out that day. But then 2, why did you decide to share in that moment?
Yeah. So basically when I came back, I went home for the holidays and I came back to Charlottesville in January. And part of my New Year goals was to try and promote Cav Futures more, and specifically my side and my perspective on what is happening in the NIL world. Partially because I wanted to bring attention to it, but partially because I wanted to make sure that all these strategies that I'm telling student athletes to use actually work. Because I've studied them, but I'm like, okay, I need to practice what I preach. So I just challenged myself to post once a week, at least on LinkedIn and Twitter, and just kind of bring people into my world a little bit more. And I was going back through my messages and I had all these interesting questions, and I included those screenshots so people could see I'm not just making it up. And I think that because I'm glued to Twitter like you, it sounds like you're also a big Twitter fan. I'm on NIL Twitter all day long. And I just think a lot of the insights are coming from people who clearly don't work directly with students or they work with one very specific type of student. And it's just not consistent with what I've been seeing from the student athletes who don't have 50,000 followers, or they don't have maybe any NIL deals yet, or maybe any interest in NIL, because as the screenshots will show you, they don't know how to create a reel for Instagram, or they don't have a public Instagram account, or they don't know how to use the influencer app to report, even though influencer makes it so easy. So just little things like that were catching me off guard, because I think a lot of other professionals in this space, I came in all right, let's make content, let's get going, let's hit the road running. And they were like, wait, stop. They were slowing me down. So I think it was important to me to share that, for any athletes who are feeling pressure, it's okay, because other people are having the same questions. And then for other professionals or people who want to get into this space, slow down.
I'm glad you shared that, because again, the more voices that share this, and really, especially those who are working on a college campus or working directly with athletes, I think the more well-rounded truth that we'll have to then operate and pivot from to make adjustments moving forward, particularly from an NIL education standpoint. But for those who have not seen the tweet, I'll make sure I include it in the description to this podcast. But some of the observations that Maddie had shared were right. They need help with apps and content creation. I also agree, just from my own seat. They all don't want to be influencers and creators. 1,000% true. And I want to make sure that we highlight what Cav Futures is doing from a professional development standpoint as well. And it's not all about the money, thankfully, which I also agree and have said countless times on both Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram. In addition to these 3, Maddie, what else are you observing in your role in regards to what athletes are sharing, asking, curious about?
Yeah. This may not be unique to NIL, but as far as execution of NIL deals, and just general operation stuff, things are gonna go wrong. And sometimes it could be very wrong, because like I said, I am very involved in the process of actually getting those brand deals done and making the content and whatever it is. And I mean, I've had student athletes who, bless their hearts, but blew off an entire photo shoot. So the production team and myself are standing there for an hour and a half because he slept through it. And it's how do you handle that? Because that's a learning moment, of course, but then you have a brand who's kind of, maybe they don't want to work with you again, or they don't want to work with that athlete. And we've been really fortunate to have very patient partners. We're pretty selective about who we work with for that reason, but just kind of trying to find the balance between oh my gosh, this is a catastrophe. and it's really not that big of a deal. Let's learn from it and just knock it out of the park next time. So kind of, again, it's okay if things don't go according to plan.
Agreed. You mentioned your role, right? Marketing, athlete engagement, or athlete engagement. Yeah, you're studying, right? You're still in school, about to graduate here shortly. You're in higher ed student affairs program.
Yep.
Why higher ed and student affairs, yo? Because that is a very unique educational field, given the work that you're doing right now in college sport.
Yeah, most people will ask me why not marketing, and they're like, why not communications? And for me, it was, if I'm going to focus on this college athlete and I'm going to be in their world and kind of a part of this collegiate environment, then I need to understand the higher ed space, because I have, I think a lot of great experience in marketing. I was fortunate enough to work with Russell Wilson and some other cool internships that like have given me that hands-on marketing experience. But how do you develop that expertise when it comes to counseling student athletes, or the laws that go with higher education, or student affairs practices in general? And a lot of it has been so relevant because the program allows me to do an emphasis on intercollegiate athletics administration. So I'm thinking, okay, the part of NIL that's interesting to me is the athlete engagement and the policy side. Like, how do we create a framework that actually works and protects the athlete and still protects their freedoms and all of that? So 10 years down the line, like, I'm a big picture person. I said that. 10 years down the line, am I going to want the marketing degree, or am I going to want the higher ed student affairs degree that takes me one step closer to an athletic director role?
I love it. And again, I told you before, I'm a higher ed graduate, master's graduate, also student affairs, PhD student. So I 1,000% agree with you, and glad that you're in the higher ed program. But I can also tell, I think the people that were listening to this, listening and or watching to this podcast currently can hear not just your expertise and your receipts, if you will, in regards to the marketing standpoint, but also how you continue to center humanity in your work. And I believe that's what's missing from NIL educators, and particularly helping them build their brand, right? You can't build a brand if you don't know who you are. And then, like, let's keep, and again, we learn that in our student development courses. Shout out to theory, which was not the funnest, most fun class, but it got done nonetheless. Maddie, as you can been in this role, what has surprised you about yourself, right? Like, what have you learned about yourself that may have been surprising or shocking? How have you grown? Like, tell us more about how it's also affected you or impacted you in whatever way.
Yeah. Well, I had to grow up really quickly. So I mentioned that I graduated in 2020 into the pandemic, and then worked with UVA football for a bit, and that job was awesome. Like I said, it's a great program, but my particular role was very small. So on the operations side of things, I was in more of a like office supply, clean the kitchen, coaches lunches, that kind of thing. And then a month later, I have this director role, and that didn't, I think it was deserved, of course, and we've done great. So obviously it has worked out, but there was a little bit of imposter syndrome, I guess, where it was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to become like ideally, I'm going to become a big resource for these student athletes. And so I guess what I've come to appreciate about myself in the last year is like my willingness to do the work and like back it up and say, okay, if I want to be an advisor or a consultant or a mentor to these athletes, I have to know what I'm talking about. And so just staying up to date on the regulations and the trends, and also their sporting events, like if I have a meeting with a baseball player, I want to be able to talk about the last game. So I knew coming into it that I was going to be passionate and driven, and this is what I wanted to be doing, but it's almost like a sigh of relief to know, okay, I am who I thought I was. I'm becoming an even better version of myself every day. I think I'm just kind of learning to continue to walk into any room, and know like I deserve to be here and I need to add my voice to this conversation. So there might be other young professionals, particularly other young women, who feel that same way, or maybe they're in that stage where they're just getting started and they're like, oh my gosh, I have this big opportunity. This is a big step. Like, just go for it.
I am who I thought I was. You're my favorite person now, Maddie. We need to make sure we get your work with Cav Futures highlighted and emphasized in the national, international scene. Seriously, because you're doing phenomenal stuff and what you're discussing. I know.
Let me say, like, I have definitely fumbled. There are probably, if any of my student athletes are listening to this, they're probably going to be like, oh, Maddie, remember that one time? But it's also how you bounce back from that moment and how you kind of like learn from it and assume responsibility and all that stuff. So I'm not shooting 100%, but I do, hustle back on defense when I can.
Hey, look, I ain't say you was perfect. I just said you dope. You dope. That's a blessing in itself, yo. Before we move to segment 3, and I gotta ask this: what's been, and again, you've done, I mentioned like 60 or so paid deals through Cav Futures. So I'm not asking you to pick a favorite athlete, but what's been one of your favorite brand deals to this point?
Ooh. There have been so many cool ones. I guess the one that comes to mind is oh my gosh. Well, the first one that comes to mind is McDonald's. So we did partner with our local McDonald's franchises, and I was able to organize the photo shoot and some of the content. And that was definitely, I won't get into it, but that was one example of a partnership where not everything went how we had planned, but the athletes were so excited to be involved, and it was really heavily focused on being involved with the Ronald McDonald House. So as much as it was about posting, about cheeseburgers, those athletes who got the sponsorship got a lot of attention because it's McDonald's, but then they put in a couple hours with the Ronald McDonald House. They met the director, they visited the home. And that was cool because I got to tag along to that and just kind of see how the impact of like a double facing or a dual sponsorship like that, where it's partly for the brand, but then partly community service oriented, can be really impactful for the athlete and the organization they're associated with.
It's love. That's super love. Segment 3. Shout out to McDonald's. I need to get my quarterly Big Mac very soon.
That was the other thing, is I got a cool a frosty, not a frosty. Oh, that's Wendy's. Oh no.
McFlurry.
What's it called? McFlurry.
Look at you. Yeah.
McFlurry, a McFlurry sweatshirt and like a McDonald's baseball cap. So I got some cool swag out of that one.
I gotta see that. Yeah, make sure you, when we post this in a few weeks or a couple weeks, make sure you upload a picture with that. Matter of fact, send me a picture of you in that McFlurry. Okay. The clip art. Yeah.
I gotta go dig it out.
Segment 3, right? We talked about a lot of different things during our time today, all of which very important. I think continue to take us a step further, a couple steps forward with preparing the future, if you will, and shaping the future. But what are 3 things you want our audience to remember and leave with after our conversation today together?
Well, the first one would be, please go follow Cav Futures on social media. It'll make me a very happy director of marketing. And we've got some really big things coming up in the next few weeks. So it might already be announced by the time this podcast goes up, but I'm definitely going to want to check out some of the moves that we're making, because at Cav Futures on every platform, it's going to have some fun stuff happening in this next few weeks. 2, I'll just go back to what I was saying earlier about kind of shooting your shot and being creative. Like, I'm definitely a big believer in, if you want to make something happen, you can. It's just a matter of how. So take that shot, message somebody, start posting about yourself. Like, people are way too humble. Well, I was going to say people are way too humble on social media. I would say the people who need to be bragging are too humble on social media. So brag on yourself. And a third thing, those are my main, that's like my main mantra, is like shoot your shot. But I'll say, like, don't sweat the small stuff and like don't play the comparison game, as easy as it is to just say that. I think student athletes especially get caught up in, they're competitive constantly and they have to be in competition constantly. So definitely, just your career and your brand is moving at its own pace. So don't focus too much on what your peers are doing, as long as you're confident in the work that you're putting into what you want.
I love it. It's 3. 1, 2, 3. That's easy. Done. Maddie, plug your social, yo. You mentioned Cav Futures.
Okay, that'll be 3.5. Follow me on social media. It's at Maddie Walsh NIL on Twitter. LinkedIn, I think it's Madeline Walsh, which you should see me commenting on all of Cav Futures LinkedIn posts. And then if you're on Instagram, hit me up at @MadelinePatricia_.
Love it. Love it. Maddie, I enjoyed our time today, my friend. Look forward to definitely learning and leading with you moving forward.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
You already know, my friend. For everyone else, man, thank y'all again for tuning in to another episode of the MOGL podcast. As you heard from Maddie today, a lot of dope stuff happening down or over or up from wherever you are in Charlottesville, Virginia. Make sure y'all follow Cav Futures. As Maddie just alluded to, it's gonna be some dope things happening over the next several weeks and definitely over the next several years to come. Look forward to seeing y'all next week for the podcast. Country Road Trust will be in touch. Morgantown. What's their song?
The Country Roads.
Yeah, I
Take Me Home, Country Road.
Take Me Home, Country. That gotta be
This
it.
is where I
I'm
use
sorry,
my
West
West
Virginia.
Coast transplant pass and say I don't know anything about what goes on over here.
My bad, West Virginia. We'll get it right before we get on the pod. But everyone else, man, thank y'all again. See y'all next week. As always, get paid, get mogul. Peace out.